Great. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Ed Bullmore, who's recently appointed as the Regius Professor of Psychiatry at King's College London. As many of you know, before this, Ed spent about 25 years at the University of Cambridge, where he served as the head of the Department of Psychiatry and also the deputy head of the clinical school. He's had numerous other titles and accolades, which I won't all list now. But beyond these achievements, he also remains an exceptionally inspiring mentor to me, to Sarah, and to many people on the call, I'm sure. So we're really delighted to have Ed, or to welcome Ed back. Ed, of course, distinguishes himself not only through his scholarship and leadership, but also through his gift for storytelling. So whether it's a quick anecdote or a full-length book, Ed knows how to turn the perfect English phrase. And I know many on this call have enjoyed reading The Inflamed Mind. And so today we're excited to hear about his latest book, The Divided Mind. Without further ado, Ed.
Thanks very much, Petra, for that generous introduction, which I greatly appreciated. So yes, I'm going to talk about a book, which is quite a challenging thing to do in an hour. I did record an audiobook version. So I have literally read through every word out loud, and I know that took me 3 days. We don't have, I think you'd go mad if I tried to spend 3 days talking about this. So I'm obviously going to give it a rather sort of abridged version, but try and sort of pick up some of the kind of key themes. And then I've got just a slide at the end, just to sort of reflect a little bit, not so much on the content of the book, but why write a book, and who do you hope to reach? Who did I hope to reach, or who did I hope might read it when I wrote it? So it's called The Divided Mind because partly because it's largely about a history of schizophrenia, and schizophrenia is a sort of made-up Greek word meaning split mind. So the divided mind, in a way, is an English translation back from the Greek of schizophrenia. But more generally, it speaks to the very sort of split and divided and divisive way that we think about the mind in general. And I start the book with a sort of introduction called The Great Divide, which tries to sort of introduce this more general idea of how split we are in our thinking, how the distinction between ourselves as individual consciousnesses and everything else in the world, including other people, forms quite early during postnatal development, a process that has been much studied, particularly by psychodynamic theorists following Freud. But it's a split that takes shape over developmental time. We're not necessarily born with an innate distinction between ourselves and others. That comes as we mature. And that fundamental distinction, in the book I call it the original schism, I argue has consequences for other habitually divided ways of thinking about ourselves and other people. For example, the split that's represented by Cartesian dualism, the philosophical idea that goes back to the early 17th century, the work of Descartes, who first summarized the case, actually quite an old idea that originated long before Descartes. You could trace it back at least as far as the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, for example, that there is a body which is material, in biblical terms, flesh, and there is a mind which is immaterial. Historically, it might have been called spirit. So this split between spirit and flesh, body and mind, goes back a long, long way. What Descartes brought to it, which was new and scientifically very liberating, was the claim that the material part, the body, the brain, was experimentally tractable, mathematically analyzable. It was something that science could engage with. And this was happening, at a time of great religious ferment and controversy. And Descartes' distinction between the material body, the body machine, and the immaterial spirit was quite useful in sort of ring fencing the spiritual aspect or soulful aspect of the human experience, separating that as the domain of religion from the material world, which was therefore opened up for scientific investigation without any taint of heresy or religious controversy. So you can think of it as a sort of way of basically allowing science to get going on the body machine without running into problems with religious authorities, such as Galileo had encountered in his investigations of the solar system around the same time. So that's one example of a split between body and mind that you can trace a long way back through history. I think we can also see echoes of this split between self and others in terms of how we think about other people as either like us or alien to us. And quite often we can see in history, and I'll show you some examples of that later on, how that split between people like us, the perfectly normal ones, the good guys, and others who are in some sense qualitatively different, alien, has led to some severe crimes against individuals, including patients. It's led to stigma. It's led to silence about a lot of the experiences of severe mental illness. So that's roughly speaking how the book starts. I've told it kind of abstract. I've tried in the writing of it to make it a little bit more anecdotal, a little bit more engaging, but I'm trying to get those basic ideas across from the outset. And then in chapter 1, I take a more autobiographical approach. And the idea here really it's not so much to, celebrate myself, but just to show how my personal history of becoming a psychiatrist and then a neuroscientist sort of happens to intersect with some of these broader background issues about self, other, how we think about body and mind, and with the long-term historical progress in our thinking about schizophrenia. So that, after that introductory chapter, the book tries to kind of interweave between the accidents of my professional history over about 30 years and the longer term history of psychiatry. And I start by telling a few stories about how difficult it is to become a psychiatrist, or at least it was, or it felt difficult to me in the 1980s. I first became intrigued by the area because I remember having a conversation with my parents about what had happened to their parents. We had originally 4 grandparents, of course, but by the time I was capable of having this conversation, there was only one still alive, and I wanted to know what had happened to the other 3. And there were quite sort of clear-cut answers for 2 of the 3. But my grandmother on my father's side was mysterious. She'd sort of died in her 50s. She died in an institution of some sort in Norfolk, in East England. It really wasn't clear why she'd been admitted to that institution, what her problems had been, what kind of treatment she'd had. But it was obviously something to do with psychiatry. My dad really was very tight-lipped on this subject, just wouldn't talk about it, which made it even more intriguing, but also created this early sense in my mind, and this is kind of like when I was about 10 or 11, I suppose, that there was something about psychiatry that was taboo and yet quite intriguing. Um, and then I got into, you know, university, and I started reading um, biomedical science as the sort of preclinical phase of my medical training. And after about a year of that, I thought, well, actually, what I really want to do is psychology, because that's what I'm most interested in, this mysterious question of where mental illness comes from. You know, ultimately, perhaps you might say, what happened to my grandmother? Could I explain that? Um, and I remember going to talk to my tutor at the time. I was at Oxford. And at the end of my first year, and saying, you know what, I think I'm going to go and do psychology instead of medicine. And he couldn't really have been more opposed to that idea. He thought psychology wasn't a science. Nothing in the mind was measurable. You know, very Cartesian way of thinking about it. Nothing in the mind is measurable, analyzable, experimentally tractable. It's all pseudoscience. There's nothing solid there. Don't do it. And I obeyed. And, you know, I felt relieved in a way that I'd done the sensible thing and carried on with my conventional medical training. And then when I started seeing patients during the clinical period of my training, I found myself continually coming back to these, what I call in the book, liminal cases. So these were patients who had some sort of medical diagnosis, but also some psychiatric symptoms. So a classic example would be a woman I remember seeing on the endocrine wards at Bart's Hospital, where I trained, who had Cushing's disease. So she had a small tumor in her pituitary gland, which was pumping out excessive amounts of cortisol, and she had become psychotic. She had developed a manic psychosis. And when the tumor was removed, her psychotic symptoms completely resolved. I found that case completely fascinating because there was clearly a single molecular cause for quite a complex psychiatric presentation. And when that molecular cause had been treated, the psychiatric symptoms disappeared. And I thought, well, if that's true for this patient with Cushing's disease, who knows how many other patients there might be out there who have psychiatric symptoms currently written off as, quotes, all in the mind, that could be driven by molecular or other biological causes that we don't yet know about. And I went to my mentor at the time and said, I was therefore thinking of training in psychiatry. And again, he really couldn't have been more opposed to that idea. And whereas my Oxford tutor had been sort of reasonably polite about it, my clinical boss at Barts was quite angry at the idea that I might go into psychiatry. And it was quite a struggle to get him to support me in moving in that direction. And this was a time, I'm not sure if this is still true in medical careers, but at that time, you really needed the support of your consultant, your boss. And if you didn't have that personal support, you really weren't going anywhere. So that was quite a long struggle. And at the end of it, I did start in psychiatry. And in the book, I tell the story of going back to see my parents and my dad saying to me, do you think you're going to take that job in psychiatry? And I said, well, I've already accepted it. And that was it. We didn't, the rest of the meal, we didn't, there was nothing said between the three of us. Me, my mum, and my dad were sitting around the table. And I felt at the time as if I was sort of attending a funeral. The funeral of their hopes for my future had been disappointed by this decision to go into psychiatry. So I'm not saying I've experienced stigma in the same way that somebody with schizophrenia experiences stigma, but I have experienced some of the prejudices that prevail against people that get close to severe mental illness. And that's something that I've always tried to carry forward, you know, as I've kind of gone on in my career in psychiatry. I've often mentored medical students and young doctors coping with similar pressures as they decide to make the choice to focus on mental rather than physical illness. It's a kind of stigma that applies not just to the patients, but to the professionals. And one of the books that I was reading at the time that really encouraged me to carry on in a direction that everybody that I consulted seemed to recommend against was this book by Susan Sontag called Illness as Metaphor. And it's a short book, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It doesn't take very long to read, but it's quite a scintillating account of how we have always kind of demonized and indulged in morbid fantasies about capricious and unpleasant diseases that we don't understand. And in the book, she mainly talks about tuberculosis and cancer. And for example, in tuberculosis, she dwells on the way that in the 19th century, when it was incurable, and many young people developed a disorder called consumption. They literally wasted away for unknown reasons. All sorts of fantasies filled the void. It wasn't like people said, you know, these young men and women are dying of consumption, and we don't know why that is. We don't like to allow a lacuna in our understanding of things. So in this case, the deaths due to consumption were filled by all sorts of weird and wonderful fantasies, one of them being that it was somehow a spiritualized form of death, and that exalted consciousness or overly sensitive personalities were more vulnerable to death by consumption. And a classic example was John Keats, who was a romantic poet who died in his late 20s of consumption. And I tell the story of how he died in this room in Rome and how different the reality of that death was to the sort of romantic fantasy of schizophrenia, of consumption at the time. But Sontag's argument was, and this is again based on the history of tuberculosis, that all of those kind of morbid fantasies about the capricious and incurable disease of consumption were eventually completely eliminated by the emergence of a proper biomedical scientific explanation, which emerged from the work of Robert Koch, who's the absolutely sort of towering figure in 19th century German medicine, who discovered the root cause of tuberculosis was a germ, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. The germ caused lesions in the lung. The lesions caused the disease. And that is a classic example of a disease entity where you've got a clinical syndrome causally related through various levels of explanation to a single causal agent, the germ. And by Sontag's account, that was what banished the demons that clustered around our thinking about consumption. It was the beacon of science and the illumination of the cause. And it was that idea that encouraged me to think, yes, I'm coping with some weird ideas about mental illness and what it is to be a psychiatrist and whether that's a good or a bad thing to do. And it's not personal, it's not to do with me, it's not to do with my parents or my tutors. This is just the way people think about fearful diseases that they don't understand. And the right and only way of dealing with that is to get to the root cause and understand better where these disorders come from so that we might be able to treat or prevent them better in future. So that was a very, for me, a very inspiring book to read at that time. And then I started in psychiatry, and I started by coming back. Well, I started by coming to the place where I now am in Camberwell, which was then called the Institute of Psychiatry. It's now called the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. And one thing I discovered, slightly to my surprise, when I got here, was that psychiatry was as internally divided as it was externally divided from the rest of medicine. So everybody in medicine basically bought into the same concept that there was some sort of disorder in the body machine which caused diseases. And most physicians and medical scientists were working somewhat in the tradition of Koch. They were either using antibiotics to treat infectious disease, or they might be researching a disease that was currently not well understood in the hope that they might be able to elucidate the causal germ. The medicine was quite coherent and homogeneous in terms of its focus on the body machine and the kind of germ model of disease, if you will. Whereas within psychiatry, it was split, and it was split body, mind. There were the brainless tribe, the mindless tribe, the biomedical wing, the psychosocial wing. And these were quite well-defended borders with quite a bit of sort of hostile interaction between proponents of the different ways of thinking about mental illness within psychiatry. I hadn't expected that. It was also interesting at this time to meet people with schizophrenia for the first time, because despite the fact that schizophrenia is quite widely used as a sort of proxy for all sorts of things, ranging from madness to badness, I hadn't actually met many people with schizophrenia, and I was 30 by this stage, and I'd been in medical training for about 7 or 8 years. And when I met people with schizophrenia as a young psychiatrist, it was quite surprising to me to discover how different they were to what I'd been led to expect. They weren't, by and large, violent, dangerous. They weren't even particularly behaviorally disturbed for the most part. In fact, their most consistent characteristic was their quietness. They tended to be quite socially isolated. It was quite difficult to strike up a relationship with them in conversation. They tended not to offer many spontaneous thoughts or words. And I learned that these were all negative symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia, and in contrast to the positive symptoms like delusions and hallucinations. I also learned the sort of diagnostic rigmarole of psychiatry at the time. So schizophrenia and bipolar disorder were both examples of psychosis, but specifically functional psychosis. And that was in contrast to disorders like Alzheimer's disease, which were regarded as organic psychosis. And functional more or less meant, all in the mind. Whereas organic could mean that it was based in the brain. And I couldn't really understand, I could never really understand why people thought that schizophrenia was a functional psychosis. Why did people think that these very severe, disabling symptoms, which impacted cognition, mobility, employability, social activity, very pervasive disabilities in the most severely affected individuals, were sort of somehow regarded as all in the mind and nothing to do with the brain or the body. I just couldn't really get my head around that. I'd done a few years of medicine and neurology before I went into psychiatry. I'd seen plenty of patients with equally severe disabilities on neurological wards and medical wards, and there'd never been any question that it was to do with the brain and the body. But when I started seeing these patients with schizophrenia in psychiatry, that was not allowed as an explanation. By definition, these were functional psychoses, which meant they couldn't be attributable to any kind of organic abnormality. And I really struggled with that, because in a way it was very easy. It was very easy to deal with the diagnostic system, in a sense. I mean, to the level that you needed to pass examinations, needed to progress as a psychiatrist. The membership examination for the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we had to learn all of this stuff about positive and negative symptoms, or functional, organic, and psychosis and stuff. It wasn't difficult, but it was, for me, conceptually quite problematic. I couldn't quite understand why we were thinking about psychotic disorders in this way. And that got me started on the history of how we'd arrived at the point that I started in psychiatry. I started in about 1990, and at the time the diagnostic standard was DSM-3. And I began to wonder, how had we got there? And it is a curious history, and it goes back a long way. And this is a little schematic which tries to summarize it. It's basically German in origin or German speaking. I mean, there were some contributions to psychiatry and neuroscience from outside the German speaking world, but it's really extraordinary. In the 19th, 20th century, first half of the 20th century, Germany, Switzerland, Austria in particular, generated an enormously disproportionate amount of the new thinking about the brain and psychiatry. And the first view in the German tradition was what I've called here the mindless tribe. It was basically an organic vision of severe mental illness, which originated with people like Flechsig and Meinert and their trainees, Kraepelin and Wernicke, and in the next generation, Meyer and Ruden. All of them took some degree of focus on the biological aspect of severe mental illness. Freud was an absolutely sort of pivotal figure in the history because he trained as a neuroscientist. He worked quite hard in Meinert's lab for a long time. He wrote several papers on things like the medulla oblongata of the lamprey, a primitive fish. And he tried to disentangle the developmental sequence of myelination in the human brainstem. And then he flipped over to psychoanalysis, which was originally formulated in terms quite similar to the neuroscience of his day, but was further developed in a way which systematically excluded everything that he knew about neuroscience and all sort of organic contributions to mental illness. So Freud and his followers, Bleuler, Jung, Klein, others, began to develop a very distinct and completely different concept of psychosis that was unembodied, had nothing to do with the brain, was all about psychodynamics and psychological development. So by the time we get to the sort of 1920s, 1930s, the dominant culture of psychiatry has been split. And it's been split along this sort of mind-body schism that I introduced at the beginning. Kraepelin is nowhere near as famous as Freud. You probably all got your own idea about what Freud did and what he thought. Kraepelin is more obscure. He's nowhere near as charismatic as Freud. His biography is not as interesting. He doesn't write anything like as fluently as Freud, and he doesn't go over so many different territories and topics. He really just focused on one thing, which was trying to understand the phenomenology of psychosis. And he wrote one book, which he rewrote and rewrote over many editions until it became an enormous, an authoritative and field-defining textbook. And the Kraepelinian concept of schizophrenia wasn't called schizophrenia. It was in fact called dementia praecox, which again is a sort of made-up classical wordage to mean precocious dementia. And what does that really look like or mean to Kraepelin? Well, these are some of the figures from his textbook on the left. So these photos at the top, these are patients who had a symptom called catatonia, which meant that you could move their limbs into any position and they would just sort of stay stuck there like a statue. So this photo on the top right there, where you've got 6 patients sitting, doing various different things, that was staged. So the photographer, presumably the psychiatrist, moved their arms and legs into those positions, made one guy put his hand on his head. Again, a slightly dehumanizing approach to the patients, and their only value is to demonstrate this particular symptom of catatonia. They're not regarded as individuals with a life story or a name or an identity. They're just examples of psychopathology. He included also some examples of art. This is actually a very beautiful drawing. It's difficult to see in detail, produced by a patient. Another person, Freud, looking at that, would doubtless have tried to interpret it symbolically, assuming that there was some meaning being conveyed by that drawing. Kraepelin assumed there was no meaning to it. In fact, the legend you might be able to see is simply a queer drawing. It was just another species of disorder, of symbolic confusion, perhaps. The one thing that Kraepelin produced out of his research, which has been most enduringly valuable, was the start of clinical epidemiology. So this was a time when the asylums were full of thousands of what were called incurably insane inmates. And Kraepelin and his colleagues organized the first systematic clinical data collection enterprise in that context. So they collected basic data on thousands of patients, several thousands of patients. And when you look back at those data set, when you look back at the data that they actually had to work with, because it's all in the archive and it can be recalled and looked at again, it's actually pretty sketchy and incomplete. But nevertheless, Kraepelin managed to kind of get some enduring insights out of it. And one of them was that the age of onset of dementia praecox, as he called it, was typically in the late adolescent, early adult period, with a median or modal age of about 22 in this histogram. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to trash Kraepelin, but he did take a particular approach to thinking about patients, and he tended to kind of disaggregate the individual experience of patients into individual symptoms and then reaggregate the symptoms to form syndromes, and then trying to generate epidemiological data like this histogram on that basis. That was basically his main clinical mode of operation. He also had a neuropathological setup. He had a team of talented people, including Lois Alzheimer, looking at brain tissue recovered at post-mortem from these patients, and trying to identify the lesion. And here again, they were following the germ model that Koch had introduced for tuberculosis and cholera. They were looking for something like a germ. Alzheimer had seen something like a germ in the brain of a single patient with what we now call Alzheimer's disease. He'd seen the plaques and tangles. But when they looked at the brains of people with schizophrenia, they didn't really see anything like that. But I've shown here what they drew, and it's curious how they saw the nervous system. They saw the cells, and you can see in the right, they've got these sort of cells with odd things in them that might be germs of the disorder. What they didn't see was what Cahal saw at roughly the same time, which is the extraordinarily beautiful tree-like dendritic branching of nerve cells and the dense forest of synaptic connectivity between cells. Kraepelin's team just didn't see that, it seems. They just saw each cell as an individual element in the tissue and were looking for lesioning of individual cells in the same way that you could see lesions in the lungs of a tuberculous patient, or you could see plaques and tangles in the lesion in the cells of a patient with Alzheimer's disease. Now, going back to the sort of autobiographical chronology, as I sort of began to sort of struggle with all these things and think them through a little bit in my mind, I also qualified as a psychiatrist. I passed this membership examination. I found myself, actually out there treating patients with psychotic disorders, and on the assumption that it was a functional psychosis and therefore almost all in the mind. And there were really only two options. There really still are only two options. Pharmacological treatment with dopamine blocking drugs, which worked to some extent for positive symptoms, but it didn't really have a very secure rationale. It kind of presumed a molecular lesion. It presumed that there was an excess of dopamine that was causing the psychotic symptoms, and the dopamine antagonists were effective because they blocked that signal. But at the time, there was absolutely no evidence for excessive dopamine release in people with schizophrenia, and there was no way of measuring it. And that made me very uneasy that we were treating people with these drugs and telling them stories about chemical imbalances in their brain, which we didn't really have any scientific evidence for. Oh, and by the way, even if we did have scientific evidence that there was a dopamine problem, well, wasn't that a physiological problem? Wasn't that a biological issue? And therefore, why were we talking about it as a functional psychosis? So I had a lot of problems with that. And then I realized that the alternative available psychological treatment, following directly or indirectly from the tradition of Freud, really wasn't accessible and didn't work for psychotic patients. So that made me feel uneasy that we were trying to treat people with these psychotic symptoms, but we didn't really have anything like the mechanistic insight that I was used to having when I was prescribing antibiotics for a patient with tuberculosis or some other infectious disease. That I didn't feel as secure when I was doling out antipsychotics for people with schizophrenia. The pictures on the right, incidentally, are from the work of Melanie Klein, and I kind of talk about her quite a bit in the book because she was a woman, obviously, and actually she was almost the first woman to break through independently in this history, because up until that point, I'm talking sort of 1930s and into the 50s, the whole story is dominated by men, and men often in quite complex patriarchal hierarchies, hierarchical relationships with each other. And Klein wasn't part of that hierarchy. She didn't train as a medic. She didn't really train as a psychoanalyst. She really learnt what she discovered about psychological development through being analyzed herself and through analyzing her children. But she did bring some key insights, one of which was that it's the quality of the child-maternal relationship is very important to the formation of the ego, the formation of the sense of self, and this happens earlier, much earlier than Freud thought it did in the first couple of years after birth. And this is some artwork that she analyzed, produced by one of her patients. She actually looked at and talked to children. Freud and the other male psychoanalysts inferred that the causes of symptoms that they were treating in adult patients had their origins in childhood, but it was Klein and actually Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, who were the first to do what you might think is the obvious empirical next step. If your theory is that childhood development is relevant, why not analyze children? So Klein, I think, emerges in my mind as a little bit of a hero in the story because of her independence of thought and some of the perspectives that she brought to the field. But we're still stuck with this situation where, as I said, you've got a division within psychiatry between body and mind, represented at the first level as the division between functional psychosis like schizophrenia and an organic psychosis like Alzheimer's disease. And then within schizophrenia, you've got another schism, a division between those that think it's all to do with psychosocial matters, ego boundaries, relational stress, who follow broadly in the tradition of Freud and will want to use psychological approaches. And then on the other hand, you've got a biomedical wing, which talks about chemical imbalances that can't be measured and uses drugs, focuses on genes, takes a more mindless approach, and follows more in the tradition of Kraepelin. And so it went on. And I was sort of thinking, well, how are we ever going to sort of resolve this tension, or discover whether or not schizophrenia has anything to do with the brain? And here, of course, imaging began to emerge. So like imaging really came through in psychiatry, neuroscience, it was about in the 1980s. And the first technology available was computed tomography, which is an X-ray based technique. And you can see a CT scan in the image at the top. It's pretty murky. There's not much tissue contrast. You can see the difference between the ventricles and the parenchyma of the brain, but you can't see the distinction between gray and white matter, for example. But that was the first thing that was available. And there was a group of psychiatric researchers in London, led by Tim Crowe, with Chris Frith and Eve Johnston, also part of the team. They're a small team funded by the MRC, and they did a number of quite disruptive studies, including one of the first case-controlled CT studies of schizophrenia, which they published in The Lancet in 1975. And this is the page, these are pages from that paper in the Institute of Psychiatry library showing that there's a difference. The ventricles are enlarged in the patients with schizophrenia. It's a signature of an organic brain disorder. Now, according to the theories of science and how science advances, this result should have been treated as a black swan. It should have been regarded as experimental refutation of the theory that schizophrenia was a functional psychosis. But Eve Johnston told me a brilliant story, which I put in the book, about how she came to give a seminar to the Institute of Psychiatry about this paper. And she presented her findings and was completely dismissed. People just didn't want to hear it. They could come up with all sorts of clever explanations for why she'd found the results that she had, which didn't necessitate challenging the orthodoxy of the time that schizophrenia was a functional psychosis. And that began to kind of wake me up to the idea that it's not as simple as the theory of Karl Popper might make you believe. Science doesn't actually advance by refuting hypotheses alone. You can refute a hypothesis, as they did, by showing that schizophrenia is an organic brain disorder. That doesn't actually change the theoretical mainstream view of it. One of the objections that people raised at the time to Eve's work was the sample was tiny. How could this be representative of schizophrenia as a whole? In the book, I tell the story about how a colleague of mine called Ian Wright decided to do a meta-analysis of the MRI data that were by then emerging, which for me was a kind of eye-opener. I didn't really, I kind of thought it was cheating at the time to kind of meta-analyze other people's data, but I now realize it was my first glimpse of open science. And when you looked at those aggregated data sets with thousands of patients, there was clearly a signal that vindicated Johnston, but still the world didn't change. Then I talk in the book about how we move away from the simplest idea of a lesion, because the other challenge to Johnston, Eve Johnston, when she presented that work, it wasn't just about the sample size, it was also, well, why do you measure the ventricles? We know the ventricles haven't got anything to do with schizophrenia or cognition. It's just because you can measure them. So, well, what do you want to measure if you've got high quality MRI data available? And the idea that what you should be measuring is not looking for local lesions, but looking for large-scale network disruptions is not a new idea. Like pretty much all of psychiatry, you can find historical precedents going back to 19th century Germany. And the idea that large-scale networks are relevant to language disorders and to psychosis originated in the work of Carl Wernicke, which is the diagram at the top on the right. And that was kind of developed by colleagues, including Lichtheim. They developed these progressively more complex and ambitious network models based on pretty crude data, post-mortem examination of handfuls of patients. They did actually make remarkably good progress given the limitations of the data they had available to them, but they inevitably overreached. The models got more and more complex. The predictions that clinicians were making weren't always vindicated by the post-mortem results. And the world turned against them quite decisively. Freud leading the charge. The last paper he wrote as a neuroscientist was a takedown of network theory. And for about 30 or 40 years, there really was no serious consideration given to that model of brain organization until Norman Geschwind in the 1960s went back to the literature, looked through it, and unearthed these ideas, reframed them in terms of contemporary neuroanatomy, and reintroduced the concept of a disconnection syndrome for neurological disorders. That was in about the 1960s. And then I tell the story of Carl Friston and Chris Frith again, taking imaging data and treating it as a digital image, analyzing it quantitatively and demonstrating that there was some evidence of functional disconnectivity in the brain associated with people with schizophrenia. So the network theory it arose around about 1890, it disappeared around 1920, it came back again around the 1960s and became experimentally measurable again in the 1990s. That's 100 years just to get back to where we started from. Then I tell the story about going to Cambridge and thinking, well, what do I do? You know, we've got the imaging, you know, Carl and Chris and other people are doing this fancy functional disconnectivity stuff, but it's still not getting to grips with the question of whether schizophrenia is an organic brain disorder. And when I was at Cambridge, I became a close colleague with Peter Jones, who was a developmental epidemiologist. And in the book, I tell the story about how Peter had done work to demonstrate that there clearly was a sort of developmental sequence of events that led up to schizophrenia. It didn't kind of come out of the blue. There was a developmental story. And we worked together as clinicians on a first episode treatment service for psychosis called Cameo, which focused on people at the earliest stages of the illness. And that led me more and more to think about how can we understand the development of brain networks, not just the kind of neurological model of, you know, you have a stroke and there's some damage to the network and then you have a language problem, but how do the networks normally develop in the brain and how could they atypically develop in schizophrenia? Oh, that's slightly weird. I've reproduced some of the bullets there. But anyway, the focus on thinking about network development coincided with becoming aware for the first time of graph theory as a new way of being able to measure the complexity of brain networks in imaging data. We started, or the field started, by thinking about the network organization of the simple worm, C. elegans. And from about 2005, our group in Cambridge and others began to translate those approaches so that we could measure network organization in the human brain. I guess that's why we're here today, and I'm giving a talk at a seminar called Making Connections, is because we began to see how powerful and interesting it would be to look at brain network organization through that prism. And without wanting to embarrass Petra, there was a kind of pivotal paper around 2015 which demonstrated how you could link brain developmental change in adolescence to the network organization of what was then called the connectome, and you could show that the developmental changes in the connectome were located in brain areas that were enriched for expression of genes associated with risk of schizophrenia. So that was really quite an important paper for me anyway, because it linked development, network organization, and what we were beginning to learn about the genetics of schizophrenia for the first time. But it also made me realize that we would have to go back to the beginning, really. We'd have to understand the genetics if we were to understand the whole story. And that filled me with faint horror because I was vaguely aware, but I hadn't really looked hard at this, that the last time psychiatry got serious about genetics, it had not ended well. And in the book, I try and tell this story, which is a difficult story to tell. Actually, it's quite a difficult subject to read about. But basically, as people probably know, from about 1933, when Hitler took power in Germany, there was a systematic campaign of compulsory sterilization prosecuted against people with severe mental illness. And on the right, you can see a drawing by a patient who is there undergoing a compulsory castration procedure administered by a nurse with a swastika armband. And that went on for several years and was then followed by a systematic campaign of extermination or killing of inmates. And that I'd sort of vaguely heard about that, but I hadn't really allowed myself to look at it very clearly. And what I hadn't seen previously was that it was psychiatry was actually sort of in the vanguard of that. When people had talked to me about what happened in Nazi Germany with the patients with schizophrenia, I'd always thought the psychiatrists, like me, were well-meaning, harmless boffins who'd somehow been sort of dragged into the slipstream of Nazi politics. But the truth is that actually the thought leaders in German psychiatry at the time were advocates for eugenics. And later, some of them at least, were actively involved in the killing campaign against patients. It's a difficult story, and we prefer not to talk about it. We still don't talk about it very much. In the bottom right, there's a photo of lots of jars of formalin with brains in them. These are brains that were quote unquote harvested from the victims of psychiatric genocide. And they're still in the basement of a research institute in Germany. There are quite a lot of unreconciled relics and memories of that time, which we just don't talk about much. And it is quite a shocking thing when you look at it in the face. These are some of the propaganda pictures that were produced with psychiatric input. Expert psychiatric input went into designing these images, which were never actually broadcast to the German public, but were intended to legitimize the campaign against severe mental illness by dehumanizing the people that were living with it. So that's about 3/4 of the way through the book, maybe 2/3. And then the rest of it, I'm just trying to kind of get away from that history, or at least explain how we evolved out of that history. How did genetics come back after the war? How do we use twin studies to disentangle heritability from familiality? The long struggle with candidate gene studies that were never adequately powered and couldn't be reproduced. And then the breakthroughs of big enough GWAS. And again, this isn't, it's not that long ago that the first significant GWAS hits for schizophrenia were reported, because it took a long time to get big enough sample sizes. And in the book, I try and tell a story about how the new genetics, at least in my view, makes a lot of sense. We see these genes emerging for connectivity, for dopamine, for glutamate, for various, brain mechanisms that we know are important for schizophrenia. I also try and make the point that these are not genes for schizophrenia. They are variants of neurodevelopmentally expressed genes that are common to us all. And I want to try and make the point that getting back into genetics does not necessarily mean we're going to get back into eugenics. There is a different way of thinking about these things. In the next but last chapter, I talk about some of the less expected results from the genetics, the implication of immune genes. How can we explain that? What could be the role of the immune system? That is to say, what could be the body's contribution as well as the brain's contribution to the emergence of psychotic symptoms. I summarise some of the evidence about how the immune system responds to threats to self quite generally, whether that's biological or psychosocial, how we now recognise that it plays a part in brain development, and how epigenetic mechanisms for gene-environment interactions mediated by the immune system could help us bring together the traditionally divided biomedical and psychosocial tribes of psychiatry. And in the final chapter, I pay homage to the anti-psychiatrists, the people like R.D. Laing, who railed against the diagnostic standards of the time back in the 60s, caused the American Psychiatric Association to shift its diagnostic standards quite decisively around 1980 when DSM-3 was published. And I think now anti-psychiatry has gone mainstream, actually. They were right, a lot of these guys, because we see the support from genetics and other sources coming through to argue against the way we've conventionally diagnosed schizophrenia and discriminated it from bipolar disorder, for example. And my closing arguments here are, let's love the new science, let's embrace it, let's think about how it could help us define a less divided and divisive way of thinking about the health of mind, brain, and body. And let's be more ambitious about prevention, but in a way that's aware of our history and engaged with people with lived experience, so we don't find ourselves going back to the past as we move into the future. That's the book. And I know I've taken more time than I was planning to, and we've only got 2 minutes left. Why did I write it? Well, because there are some things that you just can't get across in a peer-reviewed publication, I think. And I think any silence about schizophrenia tends to be stigmatizing. The public awareness of mental health science is low. People think we haven't really done much, we haven't discovered much, we don't know much more than we did, and there actually has been tremendous advance in science. It's just not very well understood. For the scientific reader, I just want to make the point that history matters. We tend to believe it doesn't. If we're scientists, we're somehow above history, but we are not. And you can see that very clearly in the way that scientific ideas are played out in the history of schizophrenia. And because I really hope that we might be about to leave the 20th century behind. I mean, it's only 2025, it's only 25 years late, but maybe we can actually move on from some of this history and take a more confident approach to prevention, which doesn't entail dehumanizing people that live with this disorder. Who did I hope would read it? Above all, the next generation, because this is going to take time. And I wanted to encourage people thinking about a future in mental health science, show them that it can be done, that progress can be made. So with that, I'll finish. And I'm genuinely sorry to have taken so long talking to you because we've only got a minute left.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was fantastic, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed every minute. So no apologies needed. Lots of clappy hands going up. I know some people do have to make it to their next meeting, so if you have to disconnect, don't worry, that's absolutely fine. I'll also stop the recording before we do a few questions, Ed, if you have time for that.
Of course.
Great. And then before people leave, I'd also just like to announce that our next speaker will be on the 6th, Hervé Isambert from the Institut Curie in Paris, and he's doing work on causal networks.